So in this video, I thought I'd do a quick video on why I don't recommend planting ranunculus in pots from my own personal experience and from what I've learned about the growing habits of ranunculus. Now, I do want to just quickly add a disclaimer that you can indeed grow ranunculus in pots, but they just will they will yield a different result. And all the problems that I mention are not intended to discourage you from growing them in pots. You may just have to factor those negatives in to when into the growing of them, and I'll explain what I mean as I go. I'll explain the countermeasures you can take if you do, because I know everybody doesn't have a garden or a raised bed or whatever, and you may have no option but to grow them in pots. If these flowers are the love of your life, then definitely do it, but you're just going to have to take some extra precautions. But the reason I decided to do this video was because obviously the DIY stores and even one of my DIY favorites, Home Bargains, started this year selling ranunculus already part grown. So it started as a bedding plant, which I've never seen before. So they've obviously been following trends, Google Trends or YouTube Trends or whatever. And I've seen them obviously sold as corms many times, and I think, they're not really explained. It does never really explains very well how to grow them. So I wonder how many people buy these corms and then end up just with nothing. So that's another video. In fact, I do have a video on how to grow the corms from scratch. But this is a new trend, having them already sold as bedding plants. So they've already got their green leaves and they're in a little plastic pot of compost. And you've just got to go and take them home, plant them up, and they will flower according to the instructions. But, from what I was thinking about, and of course they may have been grown differently, sometimes these commercially produced ones, they have enough impregnated fertilizer into that compost to get them through. But from what I could see, they were kind of short, stubby. Some of them didn't look very well at all. They looked like they had been a little bit neglected. The leaves were dried. And I thought to myself, if you have never grown ranunculus before, you're going to get these home, you're going to chuck them in a pot on your patio, and they're probably going to die. So I thought I'd do this video as to why I wouldn't grow these in pots, and if I was buying them as bedding plants, then I would plant them straight into the ground. So I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I don't recommend growing them in pots, but for those of you who have no other choice, I'm going to give you some countermeasures, of course, as well. So the first reason is that they like to be wet, not standing in wet, but when you think about in all the videos, and I've done one, I'll link it below, where you soak your corms before you plant them up, that's kind of supercharges them. They like to be plump and wet. And I've noticed when mine are growing, if we have a very dry spell, they will sort of nod their heads. And when I first grew them and they nodded their heads, I thought, oh my goodness, they are going to die, or they're strange. They can't hold their heads up. Should I stake them? In fact, when I watered them, and thoroughly watered them, by the way, which was several buckets of, the next morning, they all stood up poker straight again. Here's a sign they need watering. Look, these heads are nodding. So I'm going to give these a good water, and then they will straighten back up again. As you can see now, those ranunculus that were nodding their heads have stood straight back up. There you go. And then obviously from then I worked out, right, so these are thirsty plants, really thirsty plants. So as I say, they don't like standing in water, but they do need regular watering. I mean, like daily. Don't let the water, the compost, dry out. You don't want it to be a bog, but you don't want it to dry out. And so the obvious problem with growing it in a pot is that pots just dry out so much more quickly. For 2 reasons: they get hot and they are smaller. The compost mass inside the pot is much smaller, and therefore, there's just a lot less moisture in there. So ranunculus will not thrive in a pot for that reason. So obviously you're going to have to water them every day if you want them in a pot, if you set your heart on having them in a pot. Okay, reason number two is they like to be cool. They are spring flowers. They grow up and they do all their developing in the coolest part of the summer. So spring, basically, and then they flower in early summer. By the time the summer gets hottest and driest, they start to peter out. They've had enough. Their leaves will start to turn yellow and their flower heads will start to fade, and their petals will just start to drop off, and they will obviously produce seed heads and what have you, and you'll know they're over because they just won't look very good. So the reason why this could be a problem, this is a problem, not could be a problem, this is a problem growing them in pots, is that pots get hotter quicker than the soil. So the soil in the ground will maintain this kind of ambient temperature. It doesn't matter if it's freezing cold or boiling hot. The parameters of the soil temperatures vary much less. In the summer, when the surface of the soil gets hot, actually in the depths of the soil, it still stays quite cool. And the ranunculus really like this. And of course, if you're in a pot, the pot is already raised above the ground. The pot itself is likely to be made of something that conducts and holds the heat, such as terracotta, or even I grew mine in a galvanized tin, which was disastrous because it basically baked them. And even porcelain pots will get really, really hot in the sun. And all this hot sort of transmits into the roots of the ranunculus, and they don't like it at all. If you are going to grow them in a pot, then think about that. Think about maybe putting the plant pot somewhere where the pot itself is in shade, but the flower can rise above and get some sunshine. So maybe behind maybe another pot or something, so that the pot itself is protected from the direct sunlight, but the ranunculus itself can rise up, because the flower heads love the sun and the heat, but the roots do not, the corms do not. Number three is they like that nutrient dense compost that's very rich, that's going to really stay moist but not boggy. So it'll be free draining but will stay moist as well. And it's nutrient dense. They're hungry feeders. They really like nitrogen. So if you are going to grow them in a pot, then you will obviously really rigorously need to have a feeding schedule for them, because they will pretty quickly deplete whatever is in the pot. Now, I have just fed mine with used coffee grounds, which is nitrogen rich. So you could just save your morning coffee grounds and, every other day, sort of every week rather, go and just use them as a liquid fertilizer. Just chuck them in your watering can and water over the plant pots. So, or have a look at some. If you have other fertilizers or a compost, you could do a compost tea. But anyway, you will need to feed them if they're in a pot. But if you have them in the ground, they have access to a lot of nutrients. So it's just, yes, you do feed them still anyway. And I've just done mine with a coffee tea, as I said. But they will obviously last longer. I have a clay soil which is nutrient rich, which is then enriched again with really rich compost. So, they have a pretty nice growing medium. In a pot, that's just more difficult to achieve. It's not difficult to achieve in the first instance, but it's very difficult to maintain. So the number four is basically because of the other three factors, they don't grow as beautifully in pots, in my humble opinion. So I have grown them in the ground and in pots, and there is just no comparison as far as I'm concerned. In the ground, they make showy, beautiful, glorious flowers, and they just keep coming and coming. In pots, they struggled. They just struggled to make any kind of impact. The flowers were more pathetic, they didn't last as long, and the plants themselves, the stems were thinner, and as I said, the leaves were yellower. And the alternative scenario was that they were shorter and the flower heads appeared on these really quite short, like, 6-inch stems. That they were really less than that, even probably 4 or 5 inches. So if you were growing them for a cut flower, this just would not do at all. And so that's the other reason I don't recommend growing them in pots. And then the final reason is they just make more impact when they are planted en masse in big groups. Now, of course, if you have a massive pot, then you can obviously create the impact, or a really large raised bed, then you can create the impact. But generally speaking, most of us, when we have pots and patio containers, they're for the patio or for a small pathway, and they're not huge, and especially the ones we buy for planting bedding plants in. And so therefore first of all, they don't look that great. They look disproportionate in a pot. They just don't look their best. And second of all, when they're not planted en masse, they kind of look at, I did it last year. In fact, I planted some in my big border where I plant them en masse. And then because I wanted there's some continuity through the other borders, I actually planted some in the other borders, but they were completely lost in the other borders and in the pots. I still had some that I'd forgotten to dig up from other years and they'd come back up, but they're lost. They just don't have the impact of when you just plant them all en masse in the ground, and then you get these healthy, luxurious, gorgeous flowers that you just don't get when you try to grow them in pots, in my opinion. Anyway, if you really want to grow them in pots, please do, but still, just make those allowances, and you'll have to do a little bit of extra work to get them to look good. All right, hope this helped. Thanks for watching. See you again soon. Bye.